spend a lot of time sitting alone in my room writing, and it's nice to come out here and talk through some of these things that I'm wrestling with and share them with you. And these are ideas that I just sort of wanted to, mostly I just want to offer really as prompts. They're things that I'm curious about, I'm proposing some possible frameworks and ideas, but obviously my hope is that you will take them out into the world and do with them what you will, as long as there's consent. Today, we're going to talk about collaboration, creativity, and the American Revolution. Just a quick preface before I get into this. How many people here are performance makers of some kind? Okay. And how many of you have worked in sort of collaborative processes? Fantastic. How many of you are not performance makers but have worked in collaborative processes? Great. Okay, so you've all worked that way. So I think that a lot of what I'm going to say today might sound familiar to you. Another brief preface is that this all started with the convergence of a few things. One was a project called the Brooklyn Commune Project, which I'll talk about later, which was about the economics of cultural production and the performing arts. That work is available online at brooklyncommune.org. Also, last summer, I think it was, for some reason I started reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin, and I got super into Ben Franklin. I had always been into him, but I didn't realize how much I was into Ben Franklin. And then during the Brooklyn Commune Project, one of my colleagues, Nick Benassaraf, said, "Oh, if you like Ben Franklin, you've got to read The Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. That's the one," because we were disputing John Adams, and he was like, "No, you'll understand him better." So I want to shout out to Nick and the Brooklyn Commune and all the Brooklyn Commune folks. And all right, so today's June 9th. On or about, have my musket. On or about June 11th, 1776, a little less than 250 years ago, almost to the day, 5 men, there's only 3 in this picture. This is Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston never seemed to make the cut, but they were involved. And on June 11th, 1776, a little less than 250 years ago, these 5 guys met at Franklin's residence to discuss the content and shape of the document that would come to be known as the Declaration of Independence. The first decision they had to make was, who's going to write it? Franklin was the obvious choice, but being of advanced age and also never ever wanting to have his work edited by others again, he demurred. Adams also passed. He felt that as sort of the standard bearer of the most radical faction, anything he put forward would be eviscerated. And so it sort of fell to Jefferson, who had become the kind of poet of the Revolution. So Jefferson was actually working from a draft of the Virginia Constitution that he had already been writing. And actually, this assignment to write the Declaration of Independence, they all kind of thought was rather a menial side task. There were much more important things happening in each of their respective home states. And they were like, But they went there. I mean, I don't know, I'm sort of projecting, but, Jefferson was solving the Virginia Constitution. Franklin was old, he had other things on his plate, but they went to Franklin's house. And they were tasked with articulating the ideals of and causes for their rebellion against the most powerful nation in the world and their patron, England. Ideals that would lead to the creation of the first democratic government in Western civilization since the fall of ancient Greece 2,000 years prior. I'm going to indulge my love of Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, because he's awesome. I strongly suggest you read the Isaacson. Ben Franklin was born one of 10 children to a working-class family in Boston. He finished his formal schooling at 15, ran away to Philadelphia at 17, went on to become a celebrated author, printer, political theorist, politician, postmaster, scientist, inventor, civic activist, statesman, and diplomat. I like to think of him as a colonial blogger. Because he mastered the printing press that was sort of the new technology of sort of mass publishing. And he used this platform, his printing press, to sort of generate debates, and he printed things under lots of false names, and he, would argue with other people and start fights. It was very much like, the Gawker era of New York media, but with paper. And he was known as being a kind of a scamp. He's also super awesome because he discovered electricity. He was the first person to identify and map the Gulf Stream, the temperatures and the currents. Every time he went over to London and back, he would look at the current, and he would pour oil on the current to try and figure out how the Gulf Stream worked. He also invented, this is a big diversion, but okay. He invented bifocals, the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, swim fins, the flexible urinary catheter, the odometer, the 24-hour three-wheel clock, a long arm, that thing in the bodegas that they used to reach up stuff? Ben Franklin invented that. And he invented the glass harmonica, which is like, how you like glasses and you spin your finger around them and make noise when they have water? This is an instrument made out of those. And it was so popular, his innovations to this instrument, that like Mozart wrote stuff for it, and subsequent generations of composers wrote stuff for it. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. And he co-founded and/or founded America's first circulating library, the Library Company of Philadelphia, America's first volunteer fire department, the Union Fire Company, America's first learned society, American Philosophical Society, America's first liberal arts academy, Pennsylvania Academy and College, now the University of Pennsylvania, America's first public hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, and America's first mutual insurance company, the Philadelphia Contributorship. He suggested in 1734 that the colonies joined together in a confederation. Nobody listened. He improved street lamps so they gave more light and would not be easily vandalized, and he was one of the first people to suggest that the common cold was passed from person to person through the air, not through like magical cold fairies. And he's also a social innovator. He was one of the first people to propound this idea that we now call pay it forward. Another really interesting fact that I'm not going to go into at length is that he patented none of his inventions. He believed really strongly that that progress, both industrial and intellectual and philosophical progress, was made through sharing one's discoveries, and he patented none of his inventions. Of the other people in the room, John Adams was the eldest of three sons to a modestly successful farmer in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was a well-regarded Enlightenment political theorist, and he was sort of known as the American Cicero for his oratorial skills. Thomas Jefferson, the third of 10 children, to a modestly successful planter and surveyor in Shadwell, Virginia. He went to the College of William and Mary, where he became very influenced by the British empiricists, including John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. He became a lawyer and a member of Virginia's House of Burgesses, which led him to be a delegate to the Second Constitutional Convention. I mention all this, and I'm going to talk more about the other people, but I think it's like helpful to understand that these were like not politicians. They were really extraordinary individuals who had private lives, and they were inventors and artists and thinkers and businessmen and all kinds of things, but they weren't politicians. In June 28, 1776, the Committee of Five presented their draft to the other 50 or so members of the Second Continental Congress, where they collectively made 85 edits, revisions over the course of 2 days. That's why I asked if anybody here had worked in a collaborative situation. Imagining editing a document, making 80, and getting to agreement in 2 days, or at least getting to an agreement on a final in 2 days. Jefferson reportedly was fuming the whole time. He was sitting there cranky that people were editing his masterwork, which of course was actually an assembled, a collaboratively creative document. But on July 4th, 1776, they approved the final document and delivered it to the printer for publication. So it's 1776, and we are witness to the conflict of two immutable truths. One, the British military is invincible. Two, American independence is inevitable. The British Army and Navy are the finest fighting force in the world, and the Continental Army, not to mention the various colonial militias, are basically an army of amateurs. It's also interesting to note that the British military was entirely volunteer at that time and was made up by a lot of rural people and who had been their jobs had been vanished by the emerging Industrial Revolution. So so these were young men who were now battle weary, and this was a career for them due to the social changes in England. They weren't just some ragtag band of people impressed out of bars. That's a myth. And at the same time that, the colonies themselves are, all of these relationships between the different colonies are held to be provisional. There's no cohesion. There's no sense of a collective identity. There's no American people. There's just a bunch of different people living in America. And in the preface to Revolutionary Summer, which is another book by Joseph J. Ellis, he says that living as they were in the midst of a revolution, side note, revolution we tend to think of as a break in a linear narrative, but that's not actually what the term originally meant. It actually means like a point in a cycle of a sort of revolving wheel. So when we think about revolution as total disruption of order, that's not actually an apt framework for when we think about what revolution means. Someone cue the song by The Cult. Sorry, I'm old. It's like an 80s thing. So as Ellis said, living as they were in the midst of a revolution, they were almost certainly making it up as they went along. They were, as Ellis says, improvising on the edge of catastrophe. And the improvisation didn't end when, unbelievably, the war was won. From May 25th to September 17th, the Constitutional Convention was where 55 men, lawyers, soldiers, planters, educators, ministers, physicians, financiers, and merchants met initially to revise the Articles of Confederation. These are the loose papers holding together the colonies, and replace it with the United States Constitution. This was all moved forward by a guy named James Madison, who had studied history and political theory because he felt like the whole thing was going to fall apart. He was really worried, so he pushed. They finally got George Washington to host. Everybody went to Mount Vernon, and his vision was for a fortified national government. And this is actually the conversations that we have now between so-called Republicans and so-called Democrats about states' rights. That's where this all starts. And I'm going to talk about that more later. So James Madison. Just a little bit about him. He was also a Virginian, son of a planter, modestly successful. He became a political theorist. He's hailed as the father of the Constitution, and he's one of the primary authors of the Bill of Rights. This was an incredibly contentious, you talk about collaborative and improvisational and creative. This was an incredibly contentious process drafting the Constitution. And I think that we hear about it and we go, oh yeah, the Constitution. But imagine having over 50 really opinionated people in a room trying to craft the structure for the first democratic government on the face of the planet, and their sense of what was at stake. Almost 4 months into the process, George Mason, on August 31st, wrote, "I would sooner chop off." He wrote that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands. And when the final draft was approved on September 17th and sent out for ratification, the compromises were brutal. Nobody was happy, and probably the worst compromise, as we all know, was slavery. And then it got sent to the states for ratification. So Franklin later told a French correspondent he said, with many players of diverse prejudices and interests unable to make any uncontested moves, Madison wrote to Jefferson, the merging of these clashing interests was a task more difficult than can be well conceived by those who were not concerned in the execution of it. Much later, Madison wrote in an unpublished document, that which is the least imperfect is therefore the best government. I'm going into some detail here just because I want to sort of reinforce for anybody who's ever worked with other people in collaborative processes, this should resonate. In order to get it ratified, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton Madison wrote the Federalist, later known as the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 articles that were and essays that were written and distributed. John Jay gave I think he contributed 5 5 of them. Alexander Hamilton is another interesting figure. He was born in the West Indies, the illegitimate son of a down-on-her-luck French beauty and a hard-drinking, often bankrupt Scottish merchant. He was effectively orphaned at the age of 11. His community saw how talented he was and sent him to what was then King's College and is now Columbia University. He founded the Bank of New York and basically designed America's financial system. John Jay, he was there, was born into a wealthy family of merchants and government officials in New York City, and he was the head of the Federalist Party and the first Chief Justice. And he was also super opposed to slavery. It took 9 months until June 21st, 1788 for all the states to ratify the Constitution. So we're talking, from 1776 to 1788. We're talking about a long stretch of time where whatever it is that what America was going to be was up for grabs. Nobody really knew. They started a war with no idea where they were going to go, where it was going to end up. All they knew was that the conditions were unbearable, and they had these ideals that they wanted to move towards. It was truly an experiment. So in the 1790s, and that's the area that Founding Brothers goes into in a lot of detail, before this time, American, when you said American, it meant an inferior provincial sort of, hayseed. When you talked about a Democrat, that meant someone who would pander to the crude and mindless whims of the masses. Remember that a Republican government on the scale of the United States had never been done anywhere in the world. And everybody watching basically said, that can't be done. And we're waiting for it to fail. And like I said before, there were a lot of people living in America, but there was no American people. There was no sense that these separate states and these people together formed a unified public known as the American people. And this was all the challenges they were facing. But it was done. It was created. And it was intended on the outset, when you read the documents, to be a scalable, resilient, plastic, dynamic, evolving society. I'll editorialize that is a little bit. Personally, constitutional originalism is anti-American despotism. Because mince your words, Andy. In the intro to Founding Brothers, Ellis describes the period of the 1790s. This does not mean that the political history of the early republic can be understood as a polite forensic exercise conducted by marvelously well-behaved collection of demigods, nor is the proper image a symphony orchestra, or, given the limited numbers involved at the highest level of national politics, perhaps a chamber music ensemble. Each founding father playing a particular instrument that blends itself harmoniously into the common score. The whole point is that there was no common score, no assigned instruments, no blended harmonies. Any of you musicians in here? Improvised musicians? So then finally, after all of the chaos of the 90s and the consolidation and the fights and the arguments, things have sort of a little bit maybe stabilized. In 1796, George Washington could see the end of the era. He announced that he would not seek another term as president and would retire into private life by publishing what came to be known as his farewell address. But even this iconic text by America's most revered leader was not an act of solitary penmanship. From Ellis. The manner in which the farewell address was actually composed, as it turned out, served as a nearly perfect illustration of its central message, the need to subordinate narrow interests to the larger cause. Namely, the creation of the farewell address was an inherently collaborative process. Some of the words were Madison's, most of the words were Hamilton's, all the ideas were Washington's. The drafting and editing of the farewell address, in effect, became a metaphor for the kind of collective effort Washington was urging on the American people as a whole. No doubt, all of them were very familiar with classical philosophy, so no doubt Washington, as well as Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, were familiar with the Roman statesman Cincinnatus, who lived as a humble farmer after some political stuff went down, and he got called in to serve in Rome as the dictator because they had to defeat the Aequians, the Sabines, and the Volscians. And then after he vanquished them, he immediately resigned his near absolute authority and went back to his farm. And this is often cited as an example of outstanding leadership, service to the greater good, civic virtue, lack of personal ambition and modesty. The point being, and I think I probably hit it over the head at this point, is that they're all a bunch of men with different personalities and temperaments, skill sets, passions, often very different ideas about how to bring to fruition this great project of establishing the first democratic republic in history. But through a combination of creativity, improvisation, intelligence, circumspection, strategy, and sheer luck, they successfully collaborated on one of the greatest creative experiments that the world has ever seen, the United States of America. It seems hard now, as we exist in the current state of the great experiment, sometimes to remember what it was that brought these people together, what it was that caused them to risk their very lives for this great unknown. But when we look at this group in aggregate, whether they are from truly humble origins like Hamilton or Franklin, or from more comfortable origins like Madison or Jay, we see a group of men who would never have been allowed to realize their natural potential under the hierarchical social structures of England. They were all drawn together by a virulent hatred of monarchy and a repudiation of feudalism, of inherited wealth and privilege that would deny any person the right to realize their potential for a lack of land or title. They believed in democracy, and that through democratic institutions like public education and a free press, citizens in a democratic republic can govern themselves. They were deeply influenced by and conversant with classical philosophy. They were adherents of the Enlightenment, committed to the primacy of logic, reason, science, and rationality over religion and superstition. And in that context, they saw themselves in the light of history. What the ancients had once created and what the philosophers of England and France had speculated on, they could now bring to pass. They could now create, for the first time in ages, something truly new under the sun. And I think this is really important. It's going to come back later. In 1848, the noted German historian Leopold von Ranke wrote, "By abandoning English constitutionalism and creating a new republic based on the rights of the individual, the North Americans introduced a new force in the world. Ideas spread most rapidly when they have found adequate concrete expression. Up to this point, the conviction had prevailed in Europe that monarchy best served the interests of the nation. Now the idea spread that the nation should govern itself, but only after a state had actually been formed on the basis of the theory of representation did the full significance of this idea become clear." A little bit earlier, in 1831, after the abject failure of the French Revolution, an aristocratic Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville toured the United States. And you all are probably at least passingly familiar with Democracy in America, his masterwork that was published in 2 volumes, one in 1831, one in 1840. It's fascinating to read in retrospect. A lot of the things he identifies, the contradictions and possibilities of this new nation, he's eerily prescient. Some of the conflicts that started out then have yet to be resolved. Federal power versus states' rights, the rights of the individual versus the common good, the tyranny of the majority, the ever-present danger of oligarchy. Being an aristocrat, he seems cautiously optimistic about the virtues of democratic society. He is deeply skeptical, particularly as pertaining to the arts. I was amazed to read the arts section of Democracy in America and his opinions on theater and the arts in general. But while some of what he has predicted seems to have come to pass, I would like to think that at least in the case of the arts, I think time has proved him wrong about the virtues of democracy in the arts. The contradiction of the United States is embodied really well in Whitman, so, I mean, whatever. Song of Myself. He says, "I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass." And then later on, he continues later in the poem, the one that everybody quotes, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." But in this poem, in these words, Whitman is embodying the essence of the American experiment, that in his body rests the power of the body politic, that there's this tension between his individual liberty and his individual well-being and his individual pursuit of an enlightened way of being in a democratic society, and his attachment to the common good, the body politic, the body of the nation. And, you know, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. There's a reason why we love Walt Whitman. You know, well, there's a reason why I love Walt Whitman. So another great American is Charles Atlas. Some of you may not be old enough to remember Charles Atlas. I used to have comic books when I was a kid, and Charles Atlas had a weight. This is the famous, like, the 96-pound bully who gets sand kicked on him, and then he does Charles Atlas dynamic tension workouts, and he becomes muscly and strong. So you used to be able to order that in the back of your comic book. I didn't work. But I love this idea of dynamic tension, right? It's the name that Charles Atlas gave to this physical exercises where it's a self-resistance exercise method which pits muscle against muscle. And I just feel like that's a really wonderful. I mean, it's kind of campy relic of a certain period in American life, but I also feel like it's sort of a wonderful encapsulation of what America is. Right? It's this constant struggle between these poles that keeps us moving forward. You know, and if we were to land firmly in one or firmly in the other, we might not move forward. And so we have to sort of negotiate that always. That tension, that discussion, that argument is the center of American identity. Given that, I sort of theorize that there's a couple of characteristics of art made in America. Individualism. Tocqueville talks about individualism. Actually, it's a really interesting section, but he talks about it as isolating. And that in an aristocracy, everybody knows their place, knows their order, they stay in the same place for a long time, and they have a sense of who they are and how they are in relation to other people. In a democracy, he says you become an individual, and you lose that. And you lose that sense of being in place. And he goes back and forth. I mean, I'm not scholarly enough to analyze Tocqueville, but you know, he distinguishes between individualism and selfishness, but he talks about individualism almost as an existential condition of living in democracy. He also talks later about the Americans' propensity for association. We love to form groups and clubs and hang out together and do things together, whether it's like barn raisings or bowling or the Shriners or, you know, Franklin was a notorious organizer of associations. The Junto, which was a mispronunciation of junta, you know, and the Leather Apron Society and the Firefighter, and there's something about, you know, association. I think that when we, so that balance between individual, like as if association is kind of a cure for the isolation of individualism, and collaboration, I think, is really deep in American art made in America, particularly. You know, I'm more focused on performing arts, obviously. Improvisation is really big. High art meets popular culture. I have recently have increased my exposure to American theater greatly, or rather American musical theater, and have come to really admire Gershwin and others. Folk forms elevated to high art through virtuosity and innovation. Conditional hierarchy, meritocracy, democracy, workable utopianism, earthy irreverence, and aversity to pretension. I think another thing that is really interesting about the arts in America is that they're often a vehicle for social mobility. And collaboration and improvisation in the arts also become tools for assimilation. So for you know, the Jews, the Yiddish theater on the Bowery was this place where many people from many different parts of Eastern Europe would come together with many different traditions, and they sort of formed this new identity in America. And then they started adapting these songs and then slowly moved up to Broadway. Another really interesting function of the Jewish assimilation narrative is that what happened there actually is what was the root of Hollywood. They couldn't get, the Kodaks were notoriously, or the Eastmans, Eastmans, were notoriously anti-Semitic and wouldn't sell camera equipment to the Jews. So they found other ways to get them, and there was this land out west called California. And these were a bunch of guys that had been, making nickel, movies on the Lower East Side, and they said, let's go out to California. And there's a great book called An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. It's by a guy named Neil Gabler. And he talks about how they knew, these sort of like Eastern European Jews, they would take this risky new technology that everybody thought was a fad. They pooled their rag money. They went out west and they built Hollywood. And there was this America that they knew that they were never going to be a part of, this white picket fence, this, church-going Boy Scout America. And so they created these films, the Andy Rooney's and the, Judy Garland's and and they created these aspirational visions of an America that they would never be allowed into, they thought. And then African Americans, of course, are, where do you even start? But certainly Harlem is a great place to start. And the popularity of the music, even though it took a long, the wheels, what is it? It's slow moving, but, that's an American thing, that one can generate social mobility and social capital through creativity, regardless of your station and access to official training. And I think that part of what happens with the availability of these tools and the availability of sort of, particularly like high art meeting popular culture, the aspiration of popular culture to high art, and folk forms elevated to high art through virtuosity and innovation, I think is that every new arrival, we're a nation of immigrants, and every new, whether forced or choice by choice, and every new arrival and everyone living here is in this constant process of imagining America. We are a nation constantly imagining and reimagining ourselves, constantly performing ourselves and recreating ourselves. Specifically, so I'm just this is not by any means meant to actually mean anything, it's just some slides that I threw together, pictures. So music in America is sort of related to these ideas of democracy in the arts in America. For some reason, I started thinking about CBGB just as an idea, because it was very democratic in terms of who could go there. The name, I know that's starting a little bit in the future, but I love that the name was Country, Bluegrass, and Blues. And that's what he set out to present. And he didn't make any money with the Country, Bluegrass, and Blues. I guess he came in at the end of the folk revival or something, and he just started letting these punk kids play there. And all of a sudden, you've got the Ramones and the Talking Heads and all this stuff, and it's like anybody could play there. So he sort of starts out with bluegrass, of course, is a fascinating form. That's Bill Monroe. I put him under Muddy Waters because bluegrass, there's a movie called High Lonesome about Bill Monroe, and you learn how the syncopated rhythms and the high end of the mandolin was actually brought into bluegrass by African Americans, by slaves and free African Americans, and their musical culture was coming with the Scotch Appalachian musical cultures, and bluegrass kind of blends those together. So you have some really interesting, if any musicologists, I'm not one, but just talking about. I love the story. So I was thinking about that. Steve Reich. Everybody knows Steve Reich. Everybody know Phil Lesh. Now, Phil Lesh is the bass player for the Grateful Dead. So they both went, but this is, to me, this is America, right? Steve Reich and Phil Lesh were classmates in Mills College. They were both budding composers. Phil was really into Schoenberg, and Reich not so much. They actually made an experimental film together at one point, and were working together in, I think, what was called the Experimental Tape Lab or something, which subsequently became a music label, Outer Music or something. It still exists. But of course, Reich came back here and decided and rejected Schoenberg and rejected atonalism and became a sort of renegade composer, but was deeply influenced by jazz. Phil Lesh, the story goes, went to a Beatles concert and was like, "Yeah, we want to do that," and went on. But there are people who will say that if you listen to some of those really sort of out there feedback space things of early Grateful Dead, that's actually Phil was really into Schoenberg and noise and electronics, and they probably were exposed to Mort Subotnick and So you see this happening. Gershwin, jazz, hybrid forms, unfettered imagination, limitless possibilities. I mean, music in America is pretty much awesome. Everything from Aaron Copland to Harry Partch, who invents his own instruments. Of course, John Cage. Okay, so theater. I said I threw these together because I didn't want to make different slides for every discipline, so I'm just going to talk through it. Theater is really interesting. 1895, The Syndicate. There were producers of sensational melodramatic spectacles called I think they actually called themselves the Syndicate. And in 1895, they colluded to control the competition and prices of all the theater in North America. And it was drivel. It was sensational melodramatic drivel. And so in 1912, the Little Theater movement developed out of Chicago. And in Chicago, Boston, Seattle, and Detroit, small companies started to form out of settlement houses and universities to produce more intimate, non-commercial, and reform-minded entertainments. And that Little Theater movement gave rise to Eugene O'Neill and a number of great playwrights, a number of great theaters that subsequently, over many years and a lot of professionalization, became the regional theater movement, which kind of transformed into the Syndicate. But we can look at the Little Theater movement as a precursor to the off-Broadway movement. Another really interesting thing is the group theater. In 1931, they brought Stanislavski's method and tried to adapt that to the American idiom. And that's Lee Strasberg, Harold Clurman, a whole bunch of other people. And the name group came from the idea of the actors as a pure ensemble. There were no stars. That was their aspiration, and I think it's probably what eventually tore them apart. But it's fascinating to look back at that work and to see actually the linguistic innovations of trying to present, taking Chekhov's realism. And then, that's the point I was trying to make, is that Chekhovian realism sort of had this limited European influence, and in America, where we had this sort of open the technology to everybody, you have this sort of explosion of realist theater. And when Stanislavski's acolytes in America, for better or for worse, sort of like, there's this explosion of theater. I found a quote from Sam Shepard in PHA from 1977, talking about experimental theater. And he said, if experimentation truly has to do with taking steps into the unknown with the hope of knowing, then it seems that each time those steps are taken, they are brand new from the last time. There are certain things that you always drag with you, but when the time comes to step off the edge, you leave those things behind. If you hang on to them, you find yourself in the same place you started, so you start over again. I think so that's sort of a segue into the living theater, which was Julian Beck and Judith Malina. Judith Malina's still alive. Nick Benassaraf told me that him and a bunch of friends are taking her to Burning Man this year at 90, however many years old. God bless her. She's still fighting for the beautiful anarchist utopia revolution. And the living theater was dedicated to transforming the organization of power within society from a competitive hierarchical structure to cooperative and communal expression. They did pieces like Paradise Now and all kinds of stuff. One of the members of the living theater was Joe Chaikin. A lot of you might know Joe Chaikin. He went on to be a pivotal member of the Open Theater and the leader of the Open Theater, which was an experimental troupe exploring post-method acting technique using collaborative processes, and were contemporaneous with or influenced by Grotowski's Poor Theater in Poland. And we still have members of that company amongst us. Paul Zimmerman and his Hawking Band are still working, doing really wonderful work. This is gonna come to, I'm making a point. And a lot of teachers that were influenced by the open theater and that thinking went on to educate many of our colleagues, pig iron was had a professor at Swarthmore who was deeply influenced by Grotowski and the open theater and all that sort of stuff. And I went to school at Northwestern. A bunch of kids. Our professor was influenced. Well, actually, one of my colleagues was influenced by the open theater and went on to form Looking Glass Ensemble. And so we see the legacy around us, but we don't always know where it comes from. Also happening, so the open theater was formed in '63. In '64, Richard Schechner, who teaches here, declares war on Stanislavski in the pages of TDR and seeks to dismantle the hegemony of psychological realism. He wants to replace it with Artaud, Grotowski, the living theater, and Brecht. Happenings, game theory, 1964, and guerrilla theater, ITP. He buys 33 Wooster Street and starts the Wooster Group, or rents, or whatever. Apparently that's all shrouded in mystery. And then when the performance group, Dionysus 69, all that stuff that stops happening, the Wooster Group. And then from the Wooster Group, we get Elevator Repair Service, Radio Hole, and Jim Finley, and the Collapsible Giraffe. And through that whole lineage, we see not only Schechner, but we see Brecht. We see the visibility of labor and the equality of creative practices. The lighting the lighting guy and the set mover and the actor and the technician. Like, everybody's visible. Labor is visible. There's a non-hierarchy. The work, obviously there are leaders. Joe Chaikin was the leader. Liz Lecomte is the leader, but there's a sense of collaborative process and a commitment to that, of multiple voices and representing multiple voices with conditional hierarchies on the stage. And seeing work on stage is a really, really, it sounds like we take it for granted now, but it's actually a really revolutionary thing. We're going to show you how this is made. We're not going to, dance around it. And the amazing thing is, it's still going to be magical. It's still going to blow your mind. We will show you how we do the tricks, and you will still be amazed that the trick works. I'm going to pop back to Tocqueville really quick on work. Among a democratic people where there is no hereditary wealth, every man works to earn a living, or has worked, or is born of parents who have worked. The notion of labor is therefore presented to the mind on every side as the necessary, natural, and honest condition of human existence. Not only is labor not dishonorable among such a people, but it is held in honor. The prejudice is not against it, but in its favor. In the United States, a wealthy man thinks that he owes it to public opinion to devote his leisure to some kind of industrial or commercial pursuit or to public business. He would think himself in bad repute if he employed his life solely in living. It is for the purpose of escaping this obligation to work that so many rich Americans come to Europe, where they find some scattered remains of aristocratic society, among whom idleness is still held in honor. And here I go back to Cincinnatus and the idea of sort of conditional hierarchy and the citizen. And I mentioned all that sort of stuff because we have this wonderful, wonderful legacy of collaborative and ensemble theater in America throughout the 20th century, deeply rooted in American principles. At the same time, in England, something takes root called devised theater. The first fully devised performance was Oh, What a Lovely War, created by Joan Littlewood in the Theater Workshop in 1963, the same time the Open Theater was being founded in the United States. It transferred to the West End, then to Broadway, where it received 4 Tony Award nominations. And it was always, the thing is that devised theater piece was always meant, there was no, the devising was part of the process, but the product was always meant to be fixed, and it was always meant to be viable. And produced in regular theaters in regular ways. It wasn't like the living theater or the open theater or the performance group trying to sort of really undermine the assumptions of performance. So what is called, so now we have this trend for devised theater in the United States, and we're in a weird crisis because a lot of the work, well, it's not a crisis. What I think we see is a lot of, over the professionalization, we talked about the in my first thing, or second lecture, I talked about the global city and how the global city evolved from 2004 to 2014. So we've seen this professionalization, and I think like devised theater is a very helpful way to commodify a very messy, collaborative ensemble process. And what we've also seen is, as the sort of downtown, quote-unquote, milieu of experimental work has become professionalized, experimental becomes a series of aesthetic tropes that people perform over and over again. The work in and of itself is not necessarily experimental. So you have, here's the part where they, talk in unison, here's the dance break, here's, here's the video part, there's like these tropes of experimentalism that we've inherited. So modern dance, is an American art form, and I think we should own that. I think that's really important. Isadora Duncan's kind of predates modern dance. She free dance, but she was, bare feet, loose clothing, very free flowing. It was pretty radical at the time. 1891, Loie Fuller, also free dance, was a burlesque skirt dancer who began experimenting with the effect that gas lighting had on her silk costumes. She patented her revolutionary lighting equipment and costumes. 1905, well, I'll skip forward. In 1915, Ruth St. Denis founded the Denishawn School of Dance. And that's kind of like the glimmer on the horizon of modern dance. Martha Graham is one of her students. Martha Graham leaves that company to work as a solo artist in the Greenwich Village Follies. In 1927, newspapers begin to start sending people to modern dance, actual dance writers that aren't music or drama writers, but they're actually coming at it from a movement perspective. Another really interesting thing that I want to learn more about is that there was a European thing called Eurythmics, which is an exercise routine for learning music, actually, like a movement-based music pedagogy. And that was, women were doing that here, and that informed the creation of modern dance. And so as newspapers started writing about modern dance, education jumped in. And Bennington, in 1934, started their summer school of dance, and they had a festival. And this is really interesting, because Agnes DeMille is quoted as saying, at the 34 Bennington program, there was a fine commingling of all kinds of artists, musicians, and designers. And secondly, because all those responsible for booking the college concert series across the continent were assembled there. So it's kind of like a proto-APAP. Free from the limiting strictures of the three big monopolistic managements who pressed for preference of their European clients. As a consequence, for the first time, American dancers were hired to tour America nationwide, and this marked the beginning of their solvency. So it's really interesting, right? We have 1934 as this sort of pivotal moment in American dance as an art form, modern dance. And so we have Graham, learning from Graham is Anna Sokolow, Merce Cunningham, coming from Merce is Yvonne Rainer, Steve Paxton, Twyla Tharp, many more. And of course, coming out of Merce is Judson, which is later called postmodern dance, and that's everyday movement. Once again, it's like this constant urge towards the democratic, I think. We see this consistently over time. Modern dance did have this sort of very theatrical presentational mode to it, but its movement vocabularies and its gestures and its information, I think, came from a very open, democratic place. And I think we see then, the Judson and the postmoderns really stripping away that and sort of saying, let's look at pedestrian movement. How can things every day that everybody does be considered dance and art? A good book on that I've been dipping into is Sally Bain's Democracy's Body. And I'm also working on terpsichore and sneakers. Terpsichore. And once again, like Yvonne Rainer's No Manifesto, which I've talked about before, is like actually a great testament against pretension. And then Steve Paxton in 1972 at Oberlin does a piece called Magnesium, which is the birth of contact improvisation. And I'll never forget, I talk about this a lot. Steve Stephen Petronio does a wonderful, Steve Paxton gifted him a piece called Intravenous Lecture. And in the introduction to Intravenous Lecture, Stephen Petronio talks about the first time, he talks about going to Hampshire College, and that summer before, his aunt had taken him to see, I guess, Nureyev. And he talks about seeing Nureyev in the full Russian, masculine, front-facing, fourth wall law, and then going to Hampshire and meeting Steve Paxton, and the spine relaxes, and he's in 360 degrees, and his proprioception is totally different, and his way of being in the world is totally different. And so I think that that's also a very eloquent kind of like statement about how the art informs how we are in the world, how we think of ourselves in the world, and how American dance as a form sort of embraces this circumspection and conditional. If you contact improvisation, it's it's sharing weight, it's balancing, it's conditional hierarchies, it's learning how what are you doing? How does that inform what I do? People may pop up as a sort of star for one moment and then go back into the mass. So and then Cage is there, so we're seeing this sort of Americanization of Eastern philosophy, opening of spatial awareness, the soft spine, the conditional hierarchies. It's inclusive, it's hybrid, it's improvised, it's creative, it's collaborative. These are all democratic impulses. And I think that the legacy of this is that now, in 2014, contemporary dance makers, collaborative performance makers, musicians of all stripes are working in ways that are profoundly American and deeply democratic. The techniques of cultural production in the performing arts align with the methods and philosophies used in the design of the American experiment. Every performing arts project has the potential to be an American revolution in microcosm, a laboratory for democracy and experiment and freedom, for exploring the balance between the individual and the community, between the utopian and the practical, the possibilities and limitations of the material world to convey the ideal world we are capable of imagining, and each individual's capacity for inspiring collective action. And yet these artists, we, are working in a system that is merely creating the appearance of democracy, which encourages us to participate in a system that is structurally predisposed towards inequality and aesthetically tends towards the aristocratic. The performing arts, inherently social, inherently democratic, potentially revolutionary, are adrift. Visual art performance, from dance in the museum to social practice, with its focus on the expanded practice of a singular artist, its indifference to the audience, and by its situation firmly in the global luxury market, is merely the tip of the anti-democratic iceberg. Obviously, that's a vast generalization. The nonprofit performing arts market, we went over this in the last. See, I'm tying all 5 of the lectures together. Bet you didn't think I could do it. The performing arts market, first of all, there's the regional theater system that killed Little Theater. There's the global arts market that we see every January, which, because of the financial situation and the lack of funding in the States, tends towards down here anyway, in the so-called experimental contemporary realm, tends towards the aristocratic and the European in aesthetics. The market drives the aesthetic discourse, and artists are making work in a closed system of capital and capital allocation, not unlike the colonial era triangular trade. We go into this at length here in the Brooklyn Commune report, which is downloadable at brooklyncommune.org. But this goes into depth about the idea of funding the arts as a public good and the rise and fall of the NEA. The influence of corporate culture on philanthropy. There's 6 essays on the innovation agenda. Remember, 55% of all arts funding in America philanthropic arts funding goes to 2% of orgs with budgets over $5 million. 55% of all arts funding in America goes to the 2% of arts organizations with budgets over $5 million. Pablo Eisenberg, writing in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, said, "Almost all of America's social movements were started with ideas developed by grassroots charities, not by foundation leaders. To their credit, grant makers large and small recognized the importance of the work of such groups and gave them the money they needed to grow. But today that money would be harder for grassroots groups to find." Well, and here we have quotes from John Adams and George Washington on how the arts are very important. At the same time, the for-profit cultural world is vertically integrated, oligarchical, and monopolistic. And we're told that this is the way things ever were. We've experienced the world that way, but it's not actually true. Remember that radio wasn't popularized until 1922, and David Sarnoff, reportedly the teletype guy handling the Titanic disaster, had a brainstorm about radio as a music box in every home. He went on to create RCA and NBC, and until 1948, which was the television boom, and everybody had a television. And then in the 1950s, we had the record industry finally take off. And the record industry, I'm going to mark the death of the record industry to 2004, when Sony and BMG merged and Universal, and you had essentially two, where you once had like all of these other different, you had this really diverse landscape of record labels. You sort of had this, you have basically two. And then you also have recently Live Nation, which is like the concert promoter industry. So, you would hear those stories about like great concerts in the 60s and 70s. Live Nation has a total equity of $1.6 billion. They own Ticketmaster, Live Nation Events, and Live Nation Network. So we live in a world where both the not-for-profit and the for-profit cultural sectors are largely dominated by huge hegemonic hierarchical structures. We talked before about New York City as a global city being an advanced producer, services production node, economic giant, international gateway, political and cultural hub, serving ultra-high net worth individuals. And it is true that they are invincible. It is equally true that the cause of freedom will eventually win the day. Because it all comes in cycles. As a person, TED Talk just had this guy from Harvard talking about, as people, we tend to think that the person we are right now is the person we'll be for the rest of the time. And as a people, we tend to think that how things are is how they have ever been and how they will ever be. Or at least that things will tend to move in the direction that we can foresee from our lived experience. And we look at our current circumstances, global corporations, untouchable government, the digital age, and we imagine that these are new conditions entirely without precedent. But let's go back to 1776 and three guys in a room. The arts and sciences are essential to the prosperity of the state and to the ornament and happiness of human life. They have a primary claim to the encouragement of every lover of his country and mankind. That was George Washington. John Adams. I must study politics and war that our children may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Our children ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, and naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Ben Franklin invented the glass harmonica. Thomas Jefferson was a noted, passionate violinist and singer and music lover. George Washington was a landscape architect and an early supporter of American landscape painting that he would hang in his walls the work of artists that he felt were aesthetically sophisticated enough to impress the Europeans who would come to visit, but spoke to a uniquely American aesthetic. The founders were sons of the Enlightenment, artists, inventors, philosophers, statesmen, farmers, and entrepreneurs, polymaths who saw no contradiction between the pursuit of knowledge in the physical world and the pursuit of philosophical ideas. Think of it this way, and tell me if this sounds familiar. A diverse group of creative individuals with varied and intersecting skill sets and little to no pre-existing history together worked collaboratively to implement a shared vision. Any of you ever do that? They had no money. Ben Franklin had to go fundraise from the French. I love France, Where else can you smoke and work out at the same time? They had little but their intellect, imagination, strategic thinking, and strength of conviction. And they improvised a revolution that brought something truly new into the world. And what was the essence of that shared vision? Here's John Adams' thoughts on government. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt. The divine science of politics is the science of social happiness, and the blessings of society depend entirely on the constitutions of government, how a government is constituted. We ought to consider what is the end of government before we determine which is the best form. The happiness of society is the end of government. Therefore, that form of government which communicates ease, comfort, security, or in one word, happiness, to the greatest number of persons and in the greatest degree is the best. Some of you may be familiar with the term thinking in systems. Donella Meadows writes a lot about thinking in systems. She passed away, but it's a wonderful book, Thinking in Systems. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of design thinking. Now that we live in the internet age, some of you may actually have built websites or worked in design-driven processes. This is design thinking. These were polymath, collaborative, creative individuals working to articulate a design and a process for creating something the world had never seen. So how do we answer John Adams' question in the digital age? Do we imagine democracy as a decentralized network, a distributed network? How can we integrate design thinking into our performance-making practices? How can we reframe or rediscover the revolutionary democratic potential of collaboratively creative performance? What if we imagine every process as a laboratory for imagining how to live as a free citizen in a democratic society? Now, I'm not suggesting that all artists make political work or even address this stuff at all overtly. I'm just proposing that the current economic and political state of affairs has encouraged us as a nation to dismiss our accomplishments and focus only on our shortcomings. Just because the ideas that shaped our country came from dead white guys doesn't make them invalid. And just because the country has yet to attain perfect equality doesn't make it a failure. It has rarely been the government that has achieved America's potential. It has almost always been the people. The thing about America is that it attracts dreamers and visionaries and artists and people seeking opportunities denied to them by virtue of their social station at birth or who are just seeking a better life. And the truly amazing thing about America is that no matter who you are or where you're from, once you're here, you're an American. I know people will argue with me about that, but I believe it is that visionary quality that defines your citizenship. There are people who will argue, but I believe that history has proven it to be true, and history has proven that the succeeding waves of immigrants to America, attracted by the founding vision of a more perfectly designed government, dedicated to ensuring the happiness of society, them who keep this ship moving ever forward. So just because we've hit a rough patch doesn't mean we give up the great experiment. This is a dynamic system. And I go back to that Sam Shepard quote about theater. If experimentation truly has to do with taking steps into the unknown with the hope of knowing, then it seems that each time those steps are taken, they are brand new from the last time. We stand at the threshold, and a new world is at hand. You, the artists, the dreamers, the makers, the doers, you are now called upon to ask the big questions, the great questions, the fundamental questions. You are called upon to dare the impossible, to create your own spaces, create your own forms, find your own publics, and undertake, if you dare, the great task of reimagining our world. Systemic change requires behavioral change, requires cognitive change, and I think artists can lead the way. Thank you.